So, Paul, I read your last newsletter and I read the note that you sent me in the email. And so I want to go back to your last newsletter because I'm really fascinated by the index that you created that leads the S&P by roughly 3 months, your sentiment indicator. Because when I looked at that, and mind you, this was back in, the very end of July when I read it. And so there's been a little bit of movement in the market since then. But, based on what I saw at the time, it looked like your leading indicator suggested that the S&P could drop maybe to another 35% below where we were, or maybe that was to a maximum of 35% year to date. Wasn't really sure how to read that part, but either way, based on what you're seeing, the people that are telling us that the bottom was put in June are probably mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, the sentiment index isn't meant to be a very precise. On Thursday, the S&P will go to 2,000. Something like that. What it's doing is it's taking two measurements. One of a factual kind, which is the advanced decline ratio, and the second is a sentiment indicator, so publicly available, and we put those together. And what we saw, as you've seen in the index, is that you've got a very, very good visual correlation between movements in the S&P for the last 20 years and movements in that sentiment indicator. And then when we looked at it in more detail, but it took us quite a long time to develop that. We thought, the market looks as though it's going to fall. Let's try and get something that will help people in this area. It took us quite a bit of time in November and December to develop that. Then we tried it out in the report and said, well, fingers crossed, let's see if we're right. And so where we are, having looked at it and seen it operating, is that the best correlation is if you move the index 3 months forward. And now I don't want to claim too much for this because there's always a danger of overclaiming and so on. But on that basis, if you look at what the index said, it said you should expect a rally around July and August. And then it goes down again. Now, as I said, I don't want to give the impression that this is a hard and fast, oh, well, that's all I have to do, and so on.
Right. If it was only that simple.
Yeah, if it was all that simple, cleverer people than me would have done it. But what it is doing is it's saying the general direction is generally right. Sometimes the index is a bit more extreme, up or down. Sometimes it's bang on. So you've got to use it with judgment. But it's what we think it's doing is it's saying, look, if you're feeling a bit nervous about the market, well, in that famous Wall Street phrase, we wouldn't advise or worry if you wanted to lighten up a bit on your holdings.
No, that's great. And I find value in your indicator. I think that you're onto something, and nothing's perfect, right?
Yeah.
I am curious because we've had conversations, and while you and I haven't necessarily always had the same opinion on where things are going, I have to say that, to your credit, you've been right quite a bit. And I really appreciate that. And so I look at this and the macro picture, as you call it, the horsemen of the apocalypse, and we may add a fourth one in recently, which maybe we can get to and you can elaborate on that. But before we do that, I think there are, in my gut, right, and this could just be false, it's the boogeyman, right? But my gut is telling me that this feels a little bit like where we were in September of 2007, heading into 2008, where there were signs that there were cracks in the system, but they were getting glossed over, and Federal Reserve said everything is okay. Then it was, Ben Bernanke came out and said the markets are fine, right? And here we are today, right? The Fed is telling us that a soft landing is possible. And you've got people on Wall Street that are basically saying, look, the earnings numbers are still good. Unemployment is still reasonably strong. Therefore, we cannot be in recession, right? And I look at this and I'm just like, I can't tell you exactly what it is, Paul, but it feels to me like there are cracks in the system that were similar to subprime, but certainly it's not going to come from housing this time, right? We know housing, as far as like where that's at, there's more equity in these homes than there was back then. The ninja loans are gone. The lending practices are very different in the housing market. But there's other shadow lending that's been going on that I don't think anybody can really entirely get their head around unless you're in that business explicitly, right? And so that's what I'd like you to share with us a little bit, if you have any particular insights as to where the cracks in the system might be and where is the scary stuff that we're not hearing about.
I think I've got two answers, really. One, to answer your direct question, I think that the auto loan market is a big problem area, because what you've seen is a massive increase. I think, from memory, the number is something like 14% of household debt is now in autos. And the issue with an auto is you just can't do your job or look after your family in many places without a car. So, if you look at the way that volume has ramped up, that worries me. We'll come back to that. But secondly, whilst I agree with you that it definitely has that feeling of the sort of Bear Stearns moment and so on, and others that we've seen, I think there's something more to it than that. And it ties in with the comment from the president of the European Central Bank today, Christine Lagarde, in that what we've got today, to me, is much more similar to the 1970s and 80s, in that what we're looking at today is President Putin of Russia, weaponizing natural gas. And, he's already cut flows to Germany down to 20%, and this is August. So, it's pretty clear he's going to cut them completely sometime.
Why hasn't he done it sooner? This is the thing that I don't understand from his standpoint, right? It's like, does he just need the cash? Is that why he hasn't?
No, I don't think it's anything to do with cash at all. It's just psychologically. I think that he originally thought, sorry, we've got to back up a moment here.
Okay.
So you had Merkel in charge in Germany, and you can question why Merkel put so much effort into developing this relationship with Russia that made Germany so vulnerable to Russia, in spite of warnings from the International Energy Agency, from Presidents Bush, Obama. We don't need to go there. But I don't think he understood that Olaf Scholz as Chancellor is a different guy. So I think his original structure, just as he didn't understand that Joe Biden was not Donald Trump. If you go back to the invasion in February, I don't think for a moment he expected that a US president would start, had indeed been giving weapons and training to the Ukrainians for the past 6 months, or that the West, the Germans and the French and so on, would rally round. I think his idea was, we're going to invade Ukraine, we'll be into Kyiv in a couple of days. We've got 1,000 tanks, that's it, job done. So he miscalculated there. And he also, I think, miscalculated with Scholz, because Scholz is a new chancellor and he doesn't give the appearance of being very dynamic. He's a very solid German. I use that phrase in the best possible light. Mm-hmm. In other words, he doesn't rush to a judgment. He doesn't make headlines and say, oh, this and do that and so on. But boy, is he effective. He's been up to Canada. He's signed deals with Canada. He's been out to Qatar. He worked that you couldn't put new pipelines in very quickly, but you could find some LNG tankers and convert them, and so on. He's done a heck of a lot, but it's been, quiet, studied, methodical. And I don't think, therefore, coming back to your question, when Putin invaded, okay, he got pushed back on that, but he thought, well, the Germans, they'll be very slow, Europe won't get its act together and so on. Oh, hang on. Suddenly, they started filling the gas storage. So suddenly, Putin had to start cutting back much earlier than expected. Because I think that what he was intending to do was to toy with them and let them see them doing nothing, as Merkel had done nothing for years. So there we are. And then in October, November, boom, all your gas is gone. Now, are you going to be sensible or not? Because he's made it very clear in public statements that what he wants to do is to restore the boundaries of the former Soviet Union. So he wants Poland back, he wants East Germany back, he wants all those countries back behind the Iron Curtain.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think that with respect to, we'll call it Europe, but in particular, Germany's response, you and I are financial guys, and certainly I know that you spend some time on FinTwit, as they call it, or financial Twitter. And, it's a mixed bag, right? There's some brilliant people, and then there's some idiots with loud voices and there's everything in between, right?
Yeah.
What I'm curious about with respect to Germany in particular, but I think you could extend this into other parts of Europe as well. Although I think based on what I'm going to say, little I know about the rest of Europe as a whole, is that their response and their preparedness heading into this winter is much better than what it was originally purported. Because you get a lot of these people that are screaming around this idea that there's going to be energy shortages and, Europe is just basically doomed. But as I understand it, the LNG now, or the natural gas supplies, are back up to 80%. And by maybe November, they could be as high as 90%. So at least today, it doesn't look, now, obviously weather is going to have some say in how this all plays out, of course, but there doesn't look like there's going to be any real shortages in Europe over the next.
I don't agree with that at all.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, sure. Let me just take you back for a moment, Terry, because the parallel with what we've got today is the 70s and 80s. So some of the viewers will remember the dual OPEC cutbacks and the oil boycotts and so on, oil quotas. And so you had the first one in 73 to 74, which crashed everything. And then you had the second one in 79, which took till 85 to get through. And what they were doing was they were weaponizing oil on behalf of a political objective. So 73 was all about the Arab-Israeli war and the Palestinian situation. And then 79 onwards was around the Iranian situation. And what happened, of course, was that in those days, oil went from memory, $2 a barrel early 73 up to 10, so around sort of 70 or 80 today. And then in 79, 80, it went from 10 up to the equivalent of 90 or so, 100. Today it went up to $30. And I remember I came to work in Houston in 85 for ICI, and everybody in Houston believed, okay, the price has stopped at 30, but it will go to 100. So there was a very strong pressure by that stage that we were going. But what Putin has done is more dangerous, because natural gas is not only a fuel, but it's also the key raw material for ammonia, without which you don't get fertilizer. Mm-hmm. And if you don't get fertilizer, half of the world can't be fed. Yeah, that wasn't a typo. Half of the world, our world in data has the data there. So, and what you're already seeing, it's all around looking at the right figures at the right time, and judgment comes into this. If you look at inflation in the States dipped a bit because the oil price came down. Yep. It's the end of driving season, things like that, the release from the SPR, all that sort of thing. But food price inflation didn't. Food price inflation went up to 10.9%. And food price inflation has been rising every single month for a year. And if you talk to farmers, I did a keynote speech for the one of the main American agricultural societies, and they have their sort of biannual trip out, and I always do their keynote for them. And what was very clear was that farmers are facing an appalling time. That the cost of ammonia fundamentally has gone up tenfold in the last 6 or 9 months, and you can't pass that on because wages haven't gone up that much. I was struck. There's all sorts of anecdotal evidence. I was struck by Nordstrom saying even if we cut the price to near zero, people still can't buy it. There's a lot of people out there who don't have very much money. Mm-hmm. And the oil price has gone up a bit, to $100 or so. It's been there for a while. That's a problem. But the real problem is food prices. And that's what I mean by weaponizing it. And so what we're seeing today is the equivalent of the 1970s and 80s, but really more dangerous because it involves food as well as energy.
Well, let's talk about that, right? So it's one of the unfortunate byproducts is collateral damage, right? And so the people that are most at risk are going to be the poorer countries that simply can't afford to buy the ammonia or the fertilizer or vis-a-vis the food, right? So where I guess I'm missing this a little bit is, are you thinking that in Europe itself, there will be food shortages, or are you thinking it's going to be more expensive? So it's going beyond more expensive. This is...
I mean, you're looking in Germany, This is an official statement from the government that there's going to be rationing of natural gas. Because the thing that all these commentators miss is that your storage level going into winter is one thing, but normally you're also getting replacement product coming through the pipelines.
Mhm.
But what you have to assume is that there won't be any replacement because Russia is more than 50% of Germany's natural gas
What
supplies.
about the rest of Europe? What percentage is the rest of Europe dependent
About
upon
30% overall.
of all of Europe? And that's the reason that number is so high, is because of how highly concentrated it is in Germany. Is that a fair
Well,
statement?
yeah, I mean, the thing is about nat gas, it's relatively inflexible. So you tend to move it by pipeline. You've got Russia as a major source of natural gas from Siberia for decades. So you've got pipelines built out, and people have become reliant on those pipelines. You've got countries in Central Europe, for example. They're not near shipping, so they couldn't buy LNG if there just isn't any within the middle of Central Europe. There is no natural gas supply, so you have to pipe it in from somewhere, and you either pipe it in from Russia or you're going to have to ship it through LNG and pipe it in from Rotterdam or from Genoa or from Trieste or wherever, all of which is very expensive. Once you look at moving natural gas by tanker, you're adding in $200 or $300 because you've got to cool it down to minus 120 or something, and in order to get it into to liquefy it, and then you've got to unliquefy it when it gets to the other end. So those terminals themselves are a couple of $100 million, and you don't spend a couple of $100 million unless you feel you need to.
So let me ask you a question from the other side of this, right? I mean, it's not like Putin can redirect that pipeline from Europe to Africa or from
No, exactly, yeah.
So, I mean, he's hurting himself in this process.
Does he care? But Terry, this is geopolitics.
Yep.
Putin couldn't care less. No, but there is no difference between Putin and Stalin and the Tsars. There has never been democracy in Russia. The Russians are used to suffering. That's what they do.
No, that's a fair statement. I understand.
There is no democracy in Russia. Yes, you can see videos and TV shots of some people in the cities protesting and rallying and so on. And they're very, very brave people because they generally get locked up and beaten up and everything else. They're very brave people. But the majority, what Putin has done is he's positioned this as a continuation of, quotes, the Great Patriotic War. And so our brothers in the Ukraine have been taken over by the Nazis, the Germans. Again, that's how he describes it. And he said, once we have liberated, that's the word, once we have liberated the Ukrainian people from these Nazis, they will be marching with us into Poland and Germany. This is not about money.
You're still firmly convicted that this is a long, drawn-out affair where Putin won't stop until he's, essentially either been beaten on the battlefield in whatever way that looks like, or he moves into Poland and the Baltics and these other areas where he wants to reinstall the Iron Curtain.
Let's just look at that for a moment. What would happen, Terry, if, for example, Ukraine won, regained not only the parts of Ukraine that lost recently, but regained Crimea? What would Putin likely do?
I don't know.
Well, I think the odds are he would use tactical nuclear missiles
because he doesn't want to lose. It's because it's saving face, much like a Chinese term, saving face.
Well, yeah, but I think Putin is a psychopath.
Okay.
Stalin was a psychopath. They tend to do rather well. So if Ukraine were to win, that would not be very pleasant. What would happen if Ukraine lost? Well, he would do what he's done ever since he went into Syria. He went into Syria, went into Chechnya, went into Georgia, went into Crimea. Now he's coming in. He'd go into Poland. Poland's a member of NATO.
The question that I have is this, Paul. I understand conceptually the argument behind that. Practically, though, I find it hard to kind of imagine that he has the resources to be able to do that, right? Like first of all,
he's got more tactical nuclear weapons than any other country in the world.
Yeah, but that doesn't solve the problem, right? That doesn't
I think World War III solves the problem.
Well, no, I mean, so what does that do? I mean, it wipes out a bunch of humanity. It renders the land essentially useless for
Yeah,
wherever he deploys that, right? So
yeah.
whatever he gains is of no value. There's no human capital and there's no,
But you're thinking of him as a rational
oh,
person.
that's right. I'm projecting rational thought process.
Yeah, yeah. There was an argument that Merkel put forward when she came in, which had been in fact put forward by Schroeder, which was that we ought to open up to Russia and we ought to bring Russia into the Western system in the way that we brought in China, in the way that we brought in India, and that if we build up trade, then we build up codependence on each other. So that's the best way of ensuring that things don't ever get to today's point. Now, a lot of us felt that was pretty naive, to put it mildly. But, the theory was tried and it clearly hasn't worked.
So, when you think about markets as a whole, Paul, if we take this back to how does this impact markets? I mean, it's an incredibly bearish scenario because there's no good outcome as we would define it at this point. Either Ukraine loses and the battle goes on in other parts of Europe and it gets more serious, or Putin loses and the mushroom clouds.
What you do is you play for time. And I think that's what we do for the next 5 or 10 years. We make sure Ukraine doesn't lose. We also make sure we don't accidentally give them too much so that they win.
Sounds like a military industrial complex's wet dream, right? Just keep sending bullets and guns and missiles and all this stuff, and they all continue to get rich.
There's that element to it. There's also, sorry to go off seemingly a tangent for a moment, but it's actually relevant. We're just back from our vacation we went up to Galicia and Spain, and you're surrounded by memories of the Peninsular War, which is a little bit ahead of our time, but this is where we actually stayed in places where Napoleon's troops in 1805 to 1810 or so were going through, setting fire to everything and doing all the things that troops do. And at the same time, Wellington, who was a general, was there, and Wellington realized that he didn't have the wherewithal in order to beat Napoleon. And so he developed this plan of masterly inactivity. And Parliament, which was paying for all this, would keep writing him letters saying, why haven't you attacked? Why didn't you go there? Why weren't you doing that? To which he would reply, I'm very sorry, gentlemen. We tried to get there, but there was a problem with the river. And then some of the horses got sick. And I mean, I can't tell you how much effort we put into, but we just couldn't do it because he knew if he gave battle, he would lose. As a result, that area was completely devastated by the French troops for 5 or 6 years. But in the end, then Napoleon got diverted, went off to invade Russia. That gave Wellington the chance, and the Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo was a very, very close run thing, as they say. If the Prussians hadn't arrived when they did, Wellington would have lost. But Wellington's tactic in the end was proved to be correct. If he'd fought in Spain, he would have lost, and that would have been that. He waited. It was painful. Everybody got upset. And I think that's the situation we're in today. Geopolitics, all I'm saying is geopolitics is not a new invention of the 21st century. It's been around a very long time. It goes back to the Greeks and the Trojans. We've been fighting Troy for 10 years, and then somebody comes up with the idea, why don't we do a wooden horse?
It's kind of like watching Floyd Mayweather box. I mean, in his later years, because all he did was run around and play defense, right? He put the shoulder up, he did the Philly shell, he moved around, he never got punched, but he never knocked anybody out either. It was just like you sat there for 10 rounds or 12 rounds watching him dance and deflect punches all day long. But, it was mostly 10 rounds of frustration for the audience. And I'm not saying, as an audience, it's not like we want Putin to win or we want a loss on either side, or at least not on the Europe side. It's really just, but as an audience, it's just kind of hard to watch that because there's just no movement. It's just kind of...
Well, I'd reframe your comment, Terry, because I think that what you're really saying is we need to look at this from a different angle. Mm-hmm. So if we come back to financial markets for a moment, what we've seen in the past for the last 20 years or so has been a sort of cycle where demand begins to recover, and so prices go up, so inflation goes up, so central banks raise interest rates, and then interest rates being higher, demand starts to come down, therefore a new cycle gets ready to go. And most of Wall Street has only ever seen, you've got to be 60 or so before you've seen anything else, right? So that's what they've seen, and that's what they assume today. And even, some of the people I really respect are still saying, oh, the Fed can't possibly carry on raising rates. Well, the interesting thing was Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, saying, our models don't work anymore because our models don't take account of geopolitics, of energy prices, and demographics. And as a result, they've been underestimating for the past 2 or 3 years everything that's been happening. So what I'm suggesting is that as investors, what we now need to do is to reframe this discussion in terms of, look, we can't change what's going to happen in Ukraine. We can't change what Putin is going to do. All we need to do is to say, what is the impact of geopolitics? What is the impact of higher energy prices, particularly natural gas prices? What's the impact of aging populations? And once we've got that in our minds, then we start to say, I wonder what that means for the Dow and the S&P. I wonder what that means for emerging markets. I wonder what that means for bonds. And now we can actually go and make some money, or at best avoid losing money.
In every market, there's two sides to the trade, right? If we go back, one of the things that I think is different, Paul, about this time versus the late 1970s is the United States in particular didn't have $30 trillion in debt at that time, right?
Oh, yeah.
And China, I looked at your report, and they spent more than, or roughly $50 trillion in stimulus through COVID and everything else. And so you've got a radically different debt picture.
Yeah.
And so what do you say to the argument that it's a little bit like a poker game, right? If we sit down and there's 7 people at the table, we all know who the idiot is. So it's just a matter of,
if we don't, then it's us.
Right. That's right. But let's say we do. Okay. So it's not us, right? The outcome is inevitable. The idiot ends up losing his money, right? Because you don't play the cards, you play the other players.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, what we know is that the Fed is checkmated. From an affordability standpoint, the 10-year Treasury arguably can't get above 5% because it would cause a catastrophic budget issue, would it not?
The question is, why is the Fed relevant? The Fed was relevant in the world where geopolitics, energy prices, and demographics weren't major issues. But if you go back to the 70s, was the Fed relevant? No, the Fed only did one thing in the 70s, which was it followed through on the principle of taking away the punch bowl when the party gets going. So exactly as you say, Terry, there wasn't the debt buildup. Everything else happened the same way, but we didn't have that. Now, we've had Fed chairmen since Greenspan who believed in refilling the cup. If you haven't got enough after .com, well, you better have some more. If you haven't got enough after subprime, you better have some more. If you haven't got enough after COVID, well, you better have a whole bucket full. Drink it up quickly, boys and girls.
Do you think Powell is more Volcker or more Bernanke?
You see, I don't think it matters.
Okay.
I was working in the 70s. We didn't know who the Fed chairman was. People today who weren't there go on about Volcker. I have nothing against Paul Volcker, but he didn't bring down inflation. If you look at what happened, inflation carried on quite happily for a while until the geopolitics and the demographics and so on sorted themselves out. Paul Volcker was a fine man, but you can't. What I think Christine Lagarde was saying in her interview was, don't expect central banks to actually be able to manage a global economy of coming up to 8 billion people. You don't have enough information to do that. You can't do it for 325 million people in the States. How can you possibly come up with a model that takes in Texas, Michigan, California, New York, everybody else, and so on, and say, oh, this is the ideal person. And if we get that right there, then everything else like a set of dominoes or whatever. It's just absurd.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. I mean, the model is complex. There's too many moving parts, and
Yeah.
there isn't there.
And we don't have enough information. We rely on data, and some of the data. Look at oil. I'm trading oil and so on down in Houston. If you look at it, people say gasoline demand went up, gasoline demand went down, and so on. Okay, no. The only data you have is the data on the rack, the wholesalers, what the wholesalers have taken from the refineries. Now, I agree that's better than nothing, but it doesn't tell you how much inventory the individual service stations are taking.
Right.
It doesn't tell you how much inventory the ordinary motorist has decided to take. If people think prices are going up, they build inventory. If they think prices are going to be stable, they tend to reduce it because it costs money. We have no information on that whatsoever. And that is the biggest part of the inventory.
I understand. I don't know if we have no information, but I don't know if we have enough information. I mean, hedge funds tend to find advantages there in different ways. And I guess in the big picture, right, what my point really was, as it relates to the Fed itself, okay, look, the market sets the long-term rates, the Fed sets the short-term rates.
Exactly, yeah.
And the Fed is trying to walk a tightrope here. It's a job that I wouldn't want to have. It's arguable, in addition to the economic role that they play a political role too. So there's absolutely politics involved, and they're most definitely going to get pressure to kind of make things look a little better heading into the midterms, right? I mean, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle is in control. Whoever's in control is going to exert the pressure, right? It's just the way it is. So I understand that part of it, but where I was,
let's look at Trump. Trump hired Powell on the basis that he wouldn't increase interest rates.
Yeah, and then right, and he beat him up on Twitter all the time, right?
Yeah.
I think where Trump did it on Twitter, Biden's doing it behind the scenes, sending his.
In Greenspan's memoirs, he's absolutely categorically clear that he was always getting dialogue and comment from the White House.
Right.
The idea of an independent central bank is just absurd.
I mean, in a fantasy world, sure, but in reality, that's not how things work. Okay, so I totally get that. And so let's go back to the Horsemen of the Apocalypse, right? Because I really like that framing of things. How long do you think that this, what we'll call cyclical move towards the downside, could potentially last?
I'm a data guy. And in the report, alongside the last sentiment index, we put our view of how long this lasts, because obviously that is quite important, he says. And I look at Shiller's CAPE index, cyclically adjusted price earnings, because that seems to me a pretty good way of doing things, and he got a Nobel Prize for it. So who am I to second guess the fact that a lot of people who know more about this than I do think that was a pretty clever thing to do. And so if you look at the CAPE valuations, there's only 2 years where we've been at these kind of levels. One was 1929, and we're above that. One was 2000, and we're below that. So what we did, because the data is there for the S&P, is we said, right, let's take the day by day, start from 300 days before the thing, see how it goes up, and then map them out so that the peak in 29 is the same as the peak in January this year, and the same as the peak in 2000. And there we are. And what you see is that in both of those downturns, it was about 600 to 700 trading days.
Mm-hmm. It's 2 years. I mean, almost 2 years.
Trading days. So as with my sentiment index, I'm not claiming, I've got the key of the universe and so on. I'm just saying, if you believe that the CAPE index is a reasonable indicator, I do. If you think that we are therefore at a similar level, having peaked to what happened in 29 and 2000, you ought to believe that history is some sort of a guide, and that's how long it will take. And what you saw after 29 and what you saw after 2000 is that you don't go down 60 or 80% overnight. What happens is you go down, And then people like Jim Cramer come in and say, "Hey, don't worry, guys, it's all great. It's all back to the races again." And other people then come in after that and say, "Oh, yeah, we didn't believe that time, but this time it really is." And the only time you get to the bottom is when nobody appears. And all the conversations that people have are, "Well, it's going to get worse, isn't it?" And if there's nobody left to sell, then you've probably hit a point. It's like a top because there's nobody left to buy.
No, I see that as making a lot of sense. Where would you pinpoint where you think this all started? Where did we hit the beginning of this? And if you do the math, right, 280 trading days is roughly 75% of a year. So it's 3 years, right? Basically from start to finish. So where did this start?
So this I think it was January the 4th. It was just simply the S&P peak then. And so that's a judgment call that we have peaked and that we're coming down. As I say, that's why we developed. We felt we got to the point where there was nobody left to buy, and therefore we were inevitably going to go into a downturn. And also for all the reasons that you know about from the report, we were not particularly excited by the outlook.
I think that's fair. That's a fair assessment.
So that led us to that, and so we followed that kind of trend. And the interesting thing, as I say, is that the sentiment indicator, which may or may not be right overall, we can hope it is, was saying around July, August, you would get the first of the rallies, and then you'll get bigger rallies as you go through. But you see, if you take my view of the world further forward by saying, look, don't waste your time anymore looking at the Fed. What unfortunately has happened, at least my generation, we never knew about the Fed. We never knew about the bank.
Well, you didn't have Twitter back then either. So.
we had chats, we would all talk about this over lunch. And
was that two cans with a string in between them? Is that what that was?
I've been to Canada. I've seen the original. So, but you had at that point in the 70s and 80s, you'd got some background in understanding politics, in understanding that France was different from America, that Russia was different from so on and so on. You understood more about energy prices and what went into them, and the fact that energy prices have always been, since Spindletop, have always been a political issue. You've only got to think about Standard Oil and the trust busting, and when I went to Houston, it was only a year or so before that Ronald Reagan, as president, had deregulated oil prices, because until I think it was 1982, the Texas Railroad Commission decided how much oil would be produced in Texas and at what price it would be sold. And why the Railroad Commission? Because it was the only one that had a reach right across Texas. So it was natural in the 30s, in order to protect people. And OPEC, if you talk to anybody from OPEC, they will tell you that the articles of OPEC were based on the Texas Railroad Commission's principles. So this is nothing new. Texas did not want its oil to be given away to the north. A bit of a history between north and south. This was the South rallying together, Texas and Louisiana and so on. And so they priced their oil at the maximum price that they could in order to preserve their. So it's, all I'm saying is, so energy has always been political. It's just political on a bigger scale.
Now. It's global now as opposed to regional. Not only that, but if you look at geopolitical conflict, right? The Arab Spring started over high food prices, if I remember correctly. And so that has spurred many revolutions, frankly. And so you could see as a military strategy to increase food prices in the lands of your enemies and create political instability, right? Economic instability. I mean, you could see that as a viable strategy, and I do think just militarily from the United States' perspective, one of maybe our biggest vulnerability is our debt. And certainly our debt could be used as a weapon against us. And, it's possible there's some collusion between China, Russia, and others. Part of this is to create a new trade system that benefits them, that reduces the reliance on the US dollar. But that would be just really for their own benefit. But then as a byproduct, or maybe the primary, or maybe that's the byproduct, but the other major product is that you force the United States into having to buy all of its own debt, right? If the Federal Reserve becomes the buyer of last resort because nobody else is buying American debt, I'm not saying it's going to play out that way, but you could see where at least there's some thought behind how that could be used as a weapon against the United States.
There's all sorts of things. Debt is never a very good thing. And the issue is that you have the consumer boom in the West in the 80s and 90s, and you wanted to bring China into the global economy. And all that China could do, because it was dirt poor, most of China was earning less than $5 a day. So it couldn't buy anything, but you could get them up a ladder, if you like, from $1 towards $5 and so on. And so they would sell to the West and to the States, but they had nowhere to go with their money. So they parked their money in the States, which Greenspan then used to finance the subprime.
Mhm.
This is a very well-known story, and they continue to do that. Now, of course, China doesn't need to do that anymore because what Trump did was to break a 40-odd year pattern where Nixon had gone to China, and then following that with Deng, Reagan, everybody else, and it opened up. And the idea was, yes, there would be bumps in the road, but China and the US were the two biggest economies, and they would work together on the bigger issues. Trump blew that all out of the water. So now China doesn't trust America anymore, and Pelosi.
One could argue that China's not very trustworthy either.
Well, all I'm saying is there was a policy, Kissinger developed it, and it worked. And Trump came in and blew it out of the water.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a typical populist movement, right? This happens all throughout history when the middle class becomes disenfranchised, right?
Yeah.
There's a populist movement.
Well, I mean, the funny thing about it, for an observer, is that historically, the people who hated trade agreements were the Democrats. And it was the Republicans who wanted free trade for all the obvious reasons. And if you look at NAFTA, for example, Clinton only got NAFTA through North American Free Trade Agreement, as it then was, with Republican votes.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't get it with Democrat because they voted against it. And so this is why it was so unusual that an avowedly Republican president went against a central tenet of Republican thinking.
Well, I think if you look, Paul, I mean, both parties have shifted to where the Democrats, I think, used to be the party that cared about the lower class. Now they exploit them terribly. And I think the Republicans have started to coalesce a little bit more like the traditional Republicans around some of the Democratic stuff, mainly just because I view them all now as part of the corrupt regime. Our political system is essentially broken.
Did it ever really? I mean, I lived in Texas, and there's great biographies of Lyndon Johnson and so on. And Lyndon Johnson lost his first Senate race because he was so confident of his votes that he told his districts to fill the ballot boxes and declare them. And so his opponent then knew how many votes he had to put into the ballot boxes, and Lyndon Johnson lost. And it's documented in that fantastic biography.
Well, that's kind of funny, Paul, because I thought we have the freest and safest elections in history. And you're telling me that, you're telling me that there's actually potentially corruption in the voting process?
Well, there was corruption at that stage. This was 1948.
Right. I mean, the idea that there isn't corruption in the voting process anywhere is absurd.
Oh, yeah. Of course, I mean, it's a level of things. But the other point was that Lyndon Johnson, with KBR money, your money, used to have his envelopes, and he would hand out envelopes with cash on the Senate floor. So what we're talking about, and the Kennedy win over Nixon and so on. There's all sorts of stuff about that and so on and so forth. So we've got a different type of financial influence and so on elections. But American elections have never been clean in the sense that, if I was a UN observer, I'd say, oh yeah, you're doing a good job here.
Right. Well, that's the funny part. And it's, it ebbs and flows. Each party, the losing party accuses the other party of cheating. That's just where we're at. And
what's funny is that, everybody thought that the Republicans would do well this time because they'd taken over the states in 2020, and so they will be able to gerrymander. But what the Dems have done, if I read Nate Silver and 538 right, is the Dems in their states have gerrymandered as well.
Mhm.
So now it's all equal again.
Yeah, of course. And look, the I mean, the election, like COVID changed the whole thing, right? The mail-in ballot, the ballot boxes,
Yeah.
stuffing, like you said, Lyndon Johnson knew exactly how many votes he had. So the other guy
Yeah.
put two more than he needed in order, right? That's what happened. And if you look at,
I don't think it's that way anymore, Terry. As I say, in those days it was, a paper ballot, and so the district captain, as it were, he had the sheaf of votes, and he had the paid Mexicans, because this is where it was happening in South Texas and so on, and he just got them to put their fingerprint on, and the job was done. What you do today, I don't want to get sued by the election machine people.
fair point.
I actually think that they've done a pretty good job of automating that and making that rather difficult to fix. But what's happened has been the gerrymandering, which is my background is equivalent to what happened in Northern Ireland. That you carve out areas which your voters are in, you give them the seats, and it's not a fair distribution. And that to me
That's
is the
been
big
going on.
plus,
Yeah.
of course. Plus, of course, the enormous amount of money that you now have to run an election. We run an election in the UK, and we run it in 3 weeks. We've got a population of 65 million, so 5 times 65, maybe it should be done in 15 weeks or something. But maybe you're brighter; we could do it in 10 or something. And it's done with each candidate having a limit of about £100,000 or something to spend on leaflets and so on, and very strict rules on how much money the parties can have.
Yeah, that's all great, Paul. But in the United States, and I'm sure it's this way in the UK to some degree also. But first of all, there's no contribution because it's not, there's no paper trail on this. But the entire media complex has been leveraged. So certain parties get complete unlimited favorable coverage that they don't ever pay for, and the other parties either get only negative or no coverage at all, right? Like the we can go back, but the suppressing of the Hunter Biden story, I mean, that was very clear. All of social media got on one side of that debate, right? Regardless of whether that had anything to do with Joe Biden or not. Okay, like were they linked? Who knows?
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you, Terry. I mean, the Hillary Clinton emails. Why on earth would a Secretary of State have her own private email server? This is absurd. Why on earth does an ex-president think he can take confidential and very secret documents away with him?
Every president has done that. Obama took
the process is very clear because we now all understand it. That all the documents go to the National Archives, and then you say, look, I've got my donors who are setting up my library, and the National Archives said, fine, as long as we can protect it there, then you can have them in your library. But Obama never took papers back to Chicago with him.
He took them somewhere else, and there were big truckloads of them. But that's not the point. I mean, the point is, the reality is, this is kind of what happens in the political debate is we see the world the way that we want to see it because of our own confirmation bias. And in the end, the problem that I have with the political system as a whole is that they just don't seem to be serving the true interests of the population.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's a frustrating thing to watch, right? Because you and I have some common sense. We can see the bullshit that takes place, and we don't. And it's frustrating because for some reason, a good swath of the population, I call them useful idiots, just kind of fall in line to whatever their predisposed party thinking is, and they don't want to know about the stuff on the other side. Right? And I've gotten to the point where I want outlier free thinking candidates. And here's a good example, right? And if my Republican friends would hit me with a baseball bat, I think if they heard me say this, but if you listen to Tulsi Gabbard talk today, I think she makes a lot of interesting points. And fair enough, she's been, kind of jettisoned by the Democratic Party for different reasons. And the Republicans would have issues with some of the things that she would say, but she's a free-thinking person who calls a spade. And there's not really a home for people like that right now because the two entrenched establishments want nothing to do with actual change. And I don't know how you fix that. What really scares me, Paul, and I think, depending on your worldview, but I would think that this should scare you also, right? But this idea of a central bank digital currency where the political entities can actually literally control all of the money. And I know it doesn't matter which side of the political argument you fall on, okay? But you look at what the Canadians did, Trudeau did to the Canadian trucker envoy. I don't care about the political movement. When you can go in and debank a bunch of people and censor their finances because of their political views, it's only a matter. Naval Ravikant, who's one of my, I don't know if you know who he is. He's one of my, he's so smart and he's apolitical. So he doesn't really give a shit too much about the side because he thinks they're all, self-enriching bastards for the most part. But one of his sayings that I just think is brilliant, and he may not even come up with this, I've just heard him say it, but if you want to test a good system, give it to your enemies and see how you like it, right? Yeah. And I think, in that sense, people that thought the Canadian truckers shouldn't be doing that, the people that thought that were probably perfectly happy and okay with the fact that they got their bank accounts frozen and censored, right? But I would say then, well, what would you think if you put that kind of power in Donald Trump's hand, right?
Yeah.
Right. And that,
it is simpler than that, isn't it, Terry? It's just wrong.
Right. And that's what's really scary, Paul, is this is where we're heading.
Look what China did in Henan when people went and protested that they couldn't get their money out of the bank, and all their mobile phones went red, and they had to go back home because they weren't allowed to go anywhere.
That's the scary dystopian sort of surveillance police state. Yeah. And we have to be careful, right? Because we are sort of marching down that path. And COVID, to me, was an interesting test on the kind of compliance we could get through the use of fear and control and, the manipulation of the media outlets and all that stuff.
Well, but there's also, let me be slightly positive here. There's also the example, because I'm here in Portugal, we had the highest vaccination rate, the highest compliance rate, and there was no fear. There was nothing else. It was just, there was social solidarity. Portuguese people are very, very concerned about everybody else's family. Mm-hmm. And they, under no circumstance, were they going, as a young person, to put somebody's grandma at risk because of their behavior.
But Paul, that's great. Okay. So I would argue that the Portuguese, their values, priorities are in an awesome spot, right?
Right.
But that's a vulnerability. That is absolutely something that could be weaponized and taken advantage of because the people that are pulling the strings know exactly that about their behavior and said,
One of the reasons why Portugal is where it is because 50 years ago, up till 50 years ago, it had Salazar. And, we had a dictator from 1926 to 1974. And we had a pretty nasty dictator with, so people do remember all that.
I would hope so. Right?
Because they really don't want to go back.
No.
Same in Spain, So I mean, equally, then we come back to finance route. That's why the Germans are getting so upset about inflation. And, that's why, I went to, as you know, a Bundesbank meeting with Joachim Nagel, German president of the Bundesbank, where he got in the media and he said, we are not fixing inflation at all. This idea that we should be at 1% by 2025 is absurd. If we don't act now and fast and move inflation up high, move interest rates up to a sensible level, we are going to be back in the Weimar Republic.
Yeah.
What I think we have to recognize is that the Fed and the central banks are not in control of this. Inflation is high. Inflation will continue to go high as long as Putin is doing what he's doing on energy and food. Therefore, we should expect 5% interest rates relatively quickly, and probably we go to 10%, we may well go higher. Because if you go back in history...
You think it's going to get that high, Paul?
Why not? Why would anybody in their right mind, I love you dearly, Terry, right? You come to me for a loan, inflation is running at 8.6%. Why should I lend to you at a guaranteed loss of 2.5% or 3% or whatever? Why would I do it?
Well, either you just took great pity on me and wanted to help out with your deep-founded generosity.
This is not the bank of, I'm just saying, as an arm's length, this is not the bank of mum and dad. Where you're on the hook for your kids, as you know. But this is what will happen. And you can see it now with the US housing market.
Mhm.
The US housing market is doing the classic stage of of early stages of a crash. It's gone up far too far, too fast. It's become unaffordable. It's been based on the bigger fool theory, and now it will crash, and probably prices will come down at least 50%.
That's a big call, Paul, and that's interesting because the other side of that argument, and I'm not saying it's right, and I know you probably already know this, but I'll just lay it out there because you're an intellectual and you like to have these discussions and debates.
That's how I learn.
So the other side of that argument is, look, this isn't 08, 09 all over again because
I'm not saying it is.
well, but that's as big of a drop in housing prices.
I'm a simple man at heart, and I simply look at the house prices need to be connected to earnings. So, if you've got a rational house price, yes, it used to be 4.5 times earnings. In other words, you had 3 times the man's earnings and 1.5 times the woman's earning, because it was assumed that she would stop work for a while and have kids and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Okay, we moved on from that to the dual income family. So you could say 6 as the multiple. What's the average income today? 70 grand, 80 grand,
75,000, something like that.
so multiply that. 6, 7 is 450,000 or something. That should be the average price. It ain't.
Yeah, I understand your perspective.
So all I believe is, if you want to know the simplest way of doing finances, reversion to the mean, as Bob Farrell told us, is the way to go.
Well, I could pick your brain all day. It's been over an hour, and you've been super generous with your time, and more so, you put up with my silly questions, and I appreciate it.
I love it. This is how we learn, isn't it? It's great. I really, really appreciate your time as well. I think that it's very uncertain. As a closing thought, what I think is we have to relearn or learn for the first time, depending on our age, how to look at geopolitics, energy prices, and demographics.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to assume that the Fed is not in control of events, because the Fed, there's a famous phrase quoted of Truman with Stalin, where Truman said, look, I think we could actually get the Pope on board with this if you were to do this. And Stalin looked at him and said, and how many divisions has the Pope? And I think, if you said to Putin, well, the Fed is pretty upset about what you're doing, and so are the other central banks. And, oh, yeah, okay. And how many divisions do the central banks have?
Right.
So, they can't give me natural gas. They can't stop the invasion of Ukraine. They can't change the demographic profile. Those are the things that matter. So we don't need to spend our time worrying about what's happening at Jackson Hole or at the Fed anymore.
I mean, that's a fair point. I appreciate that's wisdom, right? Coming through a lifetime of experience, right? In financial markets and energy markets.
Yeah.
So, and obviously you lived through some of the things that went on in Europe
although I look very young indeed.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, or your family members did, and you were,
Thank you.
you were probably relatively close to it in that sense. I think we went through a long period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, but that's the anomaly, right? That's the exception rather than the rule historically. Humanity is, it's great in some ways and it's not so great in other ways.
I was going to say, it's a sort of ending thing. If anybody wanted to know about the oil markets, there's a really good book by a guy called Dan Yergin called The Prize. And, I think everybody who's ever been there thinks, this guy got it absolutely right. And it's a good read, as well as telling you what to need to know. And then the other economist that I follow is Hyman Minsky. And, Minsky never got a Nobel Prize, but his concept, which is counterintuitive, but then makes sense when you think about it, is that a long period of stability breeds instability.
Well, that's reversion to the mean, right? That's exactly what you just described.
That's right, and you can sort of see that, we had 100 years in Europe, mainly no wars at all, from 1815 through to 1914. And then really 1914 wasn't that good, So we've had a lot of stability here. And, I worry with you about the debt that's been built up. But, I'm not pessimistic. I'm just saying I think, there's money to be made here, but we have to adjust how we're doing it.
I think the way I perceive that, Paul, is you just have to look and somehow find a way to turn chaos into opportunity. right?
Exactly. Yeah. And you make some mistakes, but you learn as you go, don't you?
Right. And if you win more than you lose, right, then you should end up ahead of the game. We could all end up like Paul.
Oh my God.
Thank you so much. You're gracious. I do a lot of podcasts, but I really enjoy our chats all the time. And I appreciate your perspective. So let's stay in touch. And if there's anything I can do to be helpful outside of continuing to subscribe to your newsletter, let me know. I'm happy to help.
Okay. Get all your friends to subscribe as well.
All right. You know what? I have institutional people, and I will talk to them and see if I can get them on board. Right. We need to get you traveling more than just to Portugal. We need to get you traveling other places in the world too.
Oh, well, I haven't been to the States for a while, but for obvious reasons. But I'm available.
You better find me when you get here, buddy. All right, Paul. Have an awesome day. Thanks again so much. We'll see you, buddy.
Bye now.
Any information I discuss in this article is for educational purposes only. It is not meant to be any kind of recommendation or financial advice. The information contained in this video is intended for informational purposes only. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of J.W. Cole Financial, Inc. or J.W. Cole Advisors, Inc.